of horrendous floods in Queensland and Brisbane, Australia back in 2010 and the beginning of 2011. 35 people lost their lives and thousands more suffered destruction and despair, while 3 people went missing, which they were never found. The summer of sadness and loss to many people is now part of our history. The floods wiped out more than 78% of Queensland and were the most devastating floods in history. The area of which most deaths occurred was the Lockyer Valley area, where 16 people died. At least 70 towns and 200,000 people were affected. The damage that was done to houses, shops, land and properties cost over $2.38 billion to fix. All the deaths of animals and people and the population done to the areas would have been dearer. The floods weren't just one flood, but a series coming in every direction. The bad weather that had been going on for weeks, even months before, caused the flooding with heavy rainfall, hail, thunder and tropical storms, combined with La Nina. And the final disaster, a Cyclone Tasha on New Year's Eve, on the 24th of December 2010. December 2010's weather was the wettest that it had ever been in history. The average rainfall was measured at 8.25 inches. The climate change was also blamed as the temperature of the ocean surrounding Australia had risen by half a degree, producing more vapour. The environment was also majorly affected. Chemicals and other hazardous substances ended up in the water and eventually contaminated the water bodies that the flood ended up in. The flooding caused massive leakage in nuclear plants and has since caused high radiation in the area. The flooding killed insects that are introduced to affected areas, distorting the natural balance of the ecosystem. The floods in Rockhampton got so bad that they unleashed a plague of snakes and crocodiles. Crocodile sightings swept the cattle farming centres northeast of Brisbane. Population 75,000, while snakes up to 2 metres long were spotted around the town centre. The snakes, including highly venomous brown snakes and red-bellied black snakes, were climbing trees and hiding in people's houses as they searched for dry refuge. The snakes were a massive problem by getting into people's land, while crocodiles flushed from rivers. The snakes and crocodile plague got so bad that the residents of boats in houses near creeks or rivers got their shotguns to go snake and crocodile hunting. The snakes were in their mating season and were very cranky. State's Emergency Service Operator Director Scott Macy. Queensland has never seen flooding or weather worse than this since 1973. The flooding continued into January 2011, becoming worse in Brisbane. On the 11th of January, the Brisbane's riverbank broke and the surrounding area were forced to evacuate. 20,000 homes were affected by the floods, as well as local sites and monuments. Queensland has never seen flooding or weather worse than that since 1973. The flooding continued into January 2011, becoming worse in Brisbane. On the 11th of January, the Brisbane River's bank broke and the surrounding areas were forced to evacuate. 20,000 homes were affected by the floods, as well as local sites and monuments. At first, the floods were a one-off event in certain areas, but on the 24th of December 2010, a monsoon arrived from the Coral Sea. The rainfall did not increase, and by the 30th of the month, huge areas of Queensland were underwater, which also resulted in a massive invasion of crocodiles and snakes. 300 roads and highways were forced to be shut for safety. The disaster was said to cover 3/4 of Queensland itself. About 3,000 people are in evacuation centres across the state, and 60 schools and almost 90 kindergarten and childcare centres have been severely damaged or inaccessible. An evacuation centre has been set up at the town showground, and 61 patients and residents from the local hospital and nursing home have been airlifted to the near town of Inglewood and Warwick. Queensland Premier Anna Bling said the flooding would test the structural integrity of Goodwin in Windy level as the river remains at the peak level for more than 24 hours. Authorities hold grave fears for 12 people, 11 of them missing from the Lockyer Valley community of Murphy's Creek, and most of those 11 just from 2 families. The levee bank is designed for 11 metres. We are expecting this to hold, but we are in uncharted territory. Evacuations have occurred in Goodwin Windy, population 6,000, and over the border in the smaller New South Wales settlements of Bogabilla and Tuimilla, which have a combined population of less than 1,000. The Bureau's previous warning had forecast a peak of 10.85 metres above the record 1997 flood peak level of 10.6 metres. Hundreds of people were evacuated from their homes at Ipswich, west of the capital, with about one-third of the city expected to go underwater as the Premier River reached 22 metres. About 3,000 people were affected in the capital and 9,000 homes were expected to sustain flood damage. Parts of the CBD were inundated as a precaution. NGEX is turning off power to the inner city to protect the electrical grid. Other large parts of the city followed suit, a move that will affect tens of thousands of customers. Large parts of Brisbane were affected by flooding. A number of shops in the CBD were evacuated and the State Library was closed. Evacuation centres were established, with one at the showground being able to handle 3,000 people. More suburbs then started flooding as well, including Oxley, Milton, New Farm, Turnriff and Ballybrony. People were waking up hearing alarms at 3 in the morning. The alarms wouldn't stop and just kept going. They were sirens telling people to evacuate. Ballybrony shops were going underwater swell, as many other houses and shops, even shopping centres, were too. Apart from inner city residents, there were only a few people in the centre of Brisbane, and it is uncharacteristically empty and silent. Towns had no one in them, and they were completely empty. They were flooded and underwater like a big lake. Supermarkets were open till late, but shelves that stocked fruit, vegetables, bread and milk were largely empty. The flooding lasted for several weeks. A steady stream of debris is floating down the swollen Brisbane River, including boats ripped from their moorings by the force of the current and an entire ferry pontoon. If we see these sorts of levels in Brisbane River, we would expect to see somewhere above 9,000 properties affected significantly, and more than 30,000 other properties have some impact. The worst affected areas were those along the banks of the Burnett River and the Fitzroy. The areas around the Fitzroy flooded and forced 1,000 people out of their homes in the Theodore. The military were there to take people to the evacuation sites where it was safer. It's the first time in history a whole town had been evacuated. The flooding continued there for another 2 weeks after evacuation. The Burnett River was worst hit on the 28th and the 29th of December, where the river levels rose to 18 metres. Over 20 houses were flooded and the town were completely cut off for days. As soon as the incident of flooding and damages were released on the radio and the news, the police force sent to help those in need and to help those whose houses were getting flooded and were not safe. More than 1,000 volunteers from all over the country came forward to help the police. They were killer floods. The worst flooding areas were Toowoomba, Grantham and then Brisbane. More than 7,000 homes were destroyed, with people, important and families' possessions, wiping out everything in its path. A wall of water smashing and sweeping its way down Toowoomba, Grafton, Ipswich, Grantham and Brisbane. Thousands were warned about the floods and could see it coming with all the bad weather that has been happening, but some weren't warned and the flash flooding hit them like a ton of bricks. Lockyer Valley, Grantham, 100 kilometres west of Brisbane. 400 people injured, thousands of houses were ruined. Rooftops rescues were carried on throughout the whole duration of the floods. While the floods got worse, people getting injured got increased. Thousands of people spent nights on their rooftops, stranded, waiting, hoping for someone to come save them and get them into safely as quick as they could. There were so many men, women, children, even pets. Families waved in despair. When the weather was at its wettest, it threatened the helicopter rescuers. It was also very dangerous for boats as well, as road transport was out of the question because of people's safety. The horrific weather was hampering the search and rescue crew, especially in the Lucky Valley area. Family members and police squad knew there were people stranded and in danger, but couldn't do anything about it and were trying their hardest to fix it. Hotels, houses, units, shops, even shopping centres were flooded. Furniture out of houses were either in the rivers and lakes or outside houses. Then all hell broke loose. It was called an inland instant tsunami. It was a wall of water that crashed down the Great Dividing Range in Toowoomba, sweeping into towns below. Places like Murphy Creek, Helidon, Godden, and even Grantham. Highways were blocked, roads and bridges were destroyed. Water levels were so high, bridges were underwater. Electricity was cut in buildings, workers were sent home, basements were filled with water, riverside restaurants were wiped out and cafes floated away. The River Walk Bridge, after days of heavy rain and flooding, it set sail, 200 metres long and 1,000 tonnes. It travelled like a torpedo towards twin gateway bridges, which caused mayhem between the towns and caused difficulty. Water also flooded the Brisbane City Art Gallery, library and museums. The total rainfall was 3-day rainfall figure was 160 millimetres. The much heavier rainfall was inland, where it was more coastal and was 600 millimetres. Emergencies were unfolding everywhere. Where the drama had finally ended and the water dropped, it was clear up time. A muddy brown misery was left behind. Houses and possessions ruined, properties flooded, even places where houses were totally underwater. Caravan parks looked like they had been hit by a tornado. Homes and caravans were smashed and piled up. Places where you can't even get into houses. Walls smashed out of houses don't even look like the same houses anymore. Industrial bins on top of your roofs. Water tanks in the middle of the street. Everything inside your house that used to be important is now rubbish. Car tires and rubbish littered on top of houses and streets of destruction. Australians are rallying to help those affected by the flooding. Prisoners and the army are among those helping with the clean-up operation. Even before the floods hit Queensland, $10 million had been pledged into a telethon. English and Australian cricketers have donated part of their match fee from the first 2020 international to aid the operation, and $30,000 was raised by the players at the ground. There have been few reports of looting, but police are on standby in affected towns and cities. Near Brisbane. Warning: if I find anyone looting in our city, they will be used as flood markers.